Well, thank you so much. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I will just briefly mention, as I did to Mark Vesey yesterday at lunch, that in the first 2 years I was an undergraduate at UBC, I was cheerfully ensconced in Mary Bollard Hall. And being a country bumpkin, along with my roommate, we used to look out our window at this immense pink mansion on the other side of the road and wonder how anybody could possibly be that wealthy. In any case, I was hugely amused to discover that that old mansion has now been converted and there has been an extension to it, and this is now Green College. I guess I should probably apologize for advertising the book, but since most of what I have to say today will actually draw from that, it seemed more or less fitting. So, of course, one begins with Darwin, but mindful that many centuries before, somebody was saying much the same thing, and that was Aristotle. And a few centuries in between was David Hume. But there is Darwin, curious about where our values come from. How is it that we sometimes expend effort and energy and cost in caring for others? How can that be? And his sort of succinct take on it was that we have social instincts, not unlike Aristotle saying we are social by nature. We also develop habits from the time that we're very young, and that these habits serve us in a social context, and I will have something to say about that. And finally, there is a role for figuring things out, for understanding how to make things work so that the unit or the family will be stable and will prosper. Now, in that context, it may also be useful just to remind ourselves that, of course, before Homo sapiens, there were many other hominids. So on the vertical axis, we have time, we have space on the horizontal axis. And I love to think about Homo erectus, who lasted a very long time, and despite having only 800 cc's of brain, you have between 1,300 and 1,500, managed to rove about, build boats, or rafts, I guess, and got himself to Indonesia. Not stupid. And they also must have been intensely social. And of course, there are others. The Neanderthals had larger brains than we do, and they also lasted a fairly long time. And notice, of course, that we overlapped for some 30,000 years. And of course, it's intriguing now to realize that some of us are carrying not only genes from Homo sapiens, but also Neanderthal genes. They are amongst us still. It's also worth remembering that despite his big brain and despite lasting for a long time on the planet, the Neanderthals never got beyond using hand axes, stone tools. They never figured out a spear. It's also worth noting that for some 200,000 years, probably, Homo sapiens didn't figure it out either. They used merely hand axes. And that the development of clever tools was not something that was obvious. I mean, it seems dead obvious to me. Well, there's a stick, and here's a hand axe, and here's a thong. I could just tie them together and whack. Not obvious. So the point I want to make with this really is just that many things are now in our culture that make us seem much smarter than we are. That if we were 200,000 years ago roving about the plains of Africa, it might not occur to us to tie a stick to a stone. Now, the hypothesis then that I want to explore is really within the ambit of Aristotle and Hume and Darwin. The hypothesis is that sociability, getting along, being with others, is a basic value for social mammals. and that it is a product of natural selection. And I will explain the hypothesis about how that came to be. The hub of the story, of course, there's much in the story involving circuitry and pathways, but the hub of the story is a very ancient peptide, oxytocin. But also, I think one should say, its sibling peptide, vasopressin. They're simple in the sense that they have only 9 amino acids, and they do many, many different things in body and brain, but one of the things they do is play an important role in attachment. That all of the social activity that we have and what we learn about how to get on with each other is augmented by the reward system, which is another way of saying we learn. And finally, of course, much of the sophistication in social behavior is made possible by the elaborate expansion of the prefrontal cortex. So clearly Homo sapiens have much more in the way of prefrontal cortex than did Homo erectus. We don't really know why it seems to make us smarter or even whether it really does. The evolutionary rationale for the huge expansion of the PFC from early hominins onwards is not well understood. It eventually will be, but it isn't yet. So, to elaborate slightly where I'm going to go with this, attachment and trust are the platform in the sense of being the substructural elements, the anatomical features, if you like, for moral values. They give rise to the dispositions that contour the social problem space, that say, in effect, that this is a good solution, and they don't bother thinking about a solution out there. They also constitute the motivation to find good solutions to practical problems, by which in this context I also mean practical social problems, about how reconciliation should take place, how punishment should take place, and so forth. Social problem solving, not just for hominins, but clearly for chimpanzees, for baboons, for wolves, and for many social birds, is very, very important. We think, now birds of course have a rather different brain, and we can talk about that in the question period. I'm not going to say very much about birds just because the organization of the brain, at least at a superficial level, is different. But social mammals have an enlarged prefrontal cortex, which allows them, amongst other things, to override, to suppress impulses, to plan, and it's possible to plan further and further into the future, the more of that stuff, more of that PFC that you have. It also seems that in the development of the mammalian brain, there was an increased capacity for remembering specific events, and hence remembering what specific individuals did, what they are like, what their reputation is, and so forth. And we think that this capacity is, of course, dependent on that deep structure of the brain, the hippocampus. Now, culture. So I, of course, tend to be fascinated by and preoccupied by neuroscience and evolutionary biology. And so that's where this talk is going to focus. But I am certainly mindful that, of course, in our lives, culture plays a huge role in the values that we have and that we defend and that we live by. And I just mention here a few people who have done a lot of work, I think, on that topic, and it's not one where I feel I have much in the way of expertise. Now, I want to begin with just a couple of preliminary points, and the first one is something that I think is really very pedestrian but extremely important and typically forgotten. And it's what all psychologists know very well, which is that all of our workaday categories have a radial structure, by which I mean they have prototypes at the center where we all agree that's an instance of, let's say, a vegetable. And out from that are instances where some people say it is and some people say, maybe not. And out from that are boundaries that are fuzzy. And so in the case of a vegetable, everybody thinks that a carrot is a vegetable, at least in the Western world. And we know that because of the way psychologists have gone about looking at this. But radishes, they are not prototypical vegetables. They're certainly not the first vegetable that comes to your mind if you're asked about a vegetable. Further out somewhere in the boundary are, let's say, chanterelle mushrooms or parsley. Now, you might think that it's unimportant to spend a lot of time worrying about whether parsley really is a vegetable. And I think it's not worthwhile. And I think that's because for some of these questions, there is no right answer. It's a don't care, or at least it's a doesn't matter in this context. Now, most of our everyday concepts are like this. Scientific concepts are often made more precise, but then they end up lacking the flexibility of our everyday concepts. So phosphorylation means a very specific thing. It means a phosphate group is attached to an organic molecule. End of story. But other scientific concepts do have more flexibility, like gene. We're still not entirely sure what counts as a gene. We know that it has to do with DNA, but sometimes microRNA. And so that's a concept that is still, as it were, in development. Now, I mention this because I think that most of our social concepts also are like vegetable. That is, they have a radial structure, they have prototypes, they have fuzzy boundaries. And so when we learn concepts like what it is to be honest, or who's a friend and who's not, we don't learn necessary and sufficient conditions. What we learn are the prototypes. And we learn that, well, you know, it's really hard to say whether he's a friend or not, or whether that's really honest or not. It's kind of on the boundary. And sometimes there is no right answer. Now, in the times when I have a very dark view of philosophy, I think it's arguing about whether parsley is a vegetable. That often, some of the cases where the most heated arguments occur is way out on the boundary of the don't cares. But as I said, that's in my dark place. All right. I also think that in general, that the concept of moral, what it is to be moral, is a radial concept, and that there are boundary cases and there are prototypes, and there are, with decreasing levels of similarity, it goes out. So if you ask me to define what I mean by moral, I'm going to refer to a radial concept, and we can talk about what the prototypes are and what's on the boundary. I think whether or not to lick your knife at table is probably way out there on the boundary. Whether to wear a clown suit to a funeral is probably much closer to the inside prototype of immoral. And then there are certain things like running a Ponzi scheme, which I think we would all agree are immoral. Now, the other reason I think this is important is that I think it helps us understand cultural variation. So consider the category house. Now, if you live in Texas, then it's apt to be the case that that's going to be your prototype. But of course, Plains Indians think of this as a prototypical house, whereas the Inuit think of the igloo as a prototypical house. Now, this is important because you might say, yeah, but none of those are really houses. It's only the one that has a chimney or something. That's silly. But I also think that it makes us realize that just as what counts as a prototypical house is going to be relative to the materials available and the kind of life you live, so in lots of cases, and we can see this via the beautiful work done by anthropologists, that some of the rules or the norms or the practices people have reflect what's available, what their resources are, and their style of living. So that's the basic kind of background preliminary. I've done it rather fast, but I hope it will serve. And now I want to get really to the heart of the matter. Paul MacLean was a neuroscientist who worked at NIH for many years. And he made an observation, which always seemed to me to be really rather important, but I didn't until recently know what to make of it. He said, what's new with mammals, with the mammalian brain, is nursing and parental care, playful behavior, separation, vocalization, and mate attachment. And then he said, the history of the evolution of mammals is the history of the development of a family way of life. Well, that seems sort of okay, but I couldn't for the longest time kind of get a grip on the relation between that and sociality in general and morality in particular. Now, to tell that story of how I now see it, I'm going to start in a slightly different place. How can brains value anything? How can that be? What is that? And the answer, I think, is extractable from what we understand about evolution. That every animal that we know about is organized in such a way as to see to its own welfare and self-maintenance. I won't lose my voice. I think I'm okay. That's tea. I think I'll be all right. And so what we see is, and it's very easy to understand that, obviously, in neurobiological terms. If your brain is not organized for you to see to your own safety and food, then you're going to die and you're not going to reproduce, and that's kind of the end of that. And certainly mechanisms of pleasure and pain are very much involved in brainstem organization as it sets priorities, so that an animal that's properly wired up, now we're not even talking about mammals, we can be just talking about newts, about lizards, and snakes and frogs and what have you, who are organized to set, the brainstem is organized to set priorities, meaning that if it's terribly thirsty, but there's a predator coming, then you better hightail it, thirst notwithstanding. Now, something very different happened as a result of the evolution of mammals. And with the evolution of mammals, what we see is the expansion of the domain of caring, from self to others, where those others in the first instance are infants. Now, how exactly did that happen? The answer, of course, is not known in anything like truly satisfying detail, but we can kind of chart how the story goes. So in the pre-mammalian period, there are no homeotherms, there are no warm-blooded animals, until at some point warm-blooded creatures, sauropsids, appeared. They had an extraordinary advantage. They could hunt at night. And there were all these sluggish reptiles lying around waiting for the sun to come up so that they could move. And so it was easy pickings. The other aspect of this meant that if you're warm-blooded, you use a vast amount more energy. So pound for pound, your energy requirements are about an order of magnitude greater, which means you've got to eat a lot more. And so as the warm-blooded animals continued to develop, it turned out that not only did it give them a special place to feed, but also they could move to other places that were cold. And so it gave them a certain kind of flexibility. However, as I said, the downside is you have to eat a lot. Now, whereas a particular patch of land could support quite a lot of lizards, it may only be able to support a few rats. And so it was necessary, as these guys flourished, to spread out. Now, they needed then to be smart. And how do you get smart? Well, you presumably develop a cortex, or so we think. And one of the things that you don't want to do if you're Mother Nature is to wire up the brain so that you have provided for every contingency. You want this animal to be flexible, to go into new niches, to do new things, and so forth. But you can't build a genome that builds a brain for every contingency. So what you want to do is have the thing born fairly immature so that the brain is tuned up to the environment that it happens to go in. It's always cheaper to build learning machinery than it is to build for every possible contingency. So what happened then was that you have offspring that are born dependent. Well, that's not going to work unless the brain of the mother is organized to take care of it, until it's able to take care of itself. And so basically what you have is this lovely kind of trade-off between learning capacity, but immaturity, and on the other hand, newborn independence. And as we know, of course, things like turtles, the mom just lays the eggs hatch in the nice warm sand, and then when the turtle hatches, he takes off for the ocean, and that's that. Now, I found that sometimes in talks, not everybody knows exactly what I mean by cortex, so I just stuck this slide in. So you've all seen pictures of the cerebrum. And what you're looking at on the left-hand side is a slice through this way. And what you're looking at in the purple is the only bit that is the cortex. All right? So it's the outer rind of the cerebrum. And all of this white stuff are sort of axons, tracts, fiber tracts from the cortex. And when you look at it in a finer grain, what you can see is that it has at least 6 layers. And that's totally new with mammals. We don't see anything like that in reptiles. So that a turtle might have a kind of, 2-layer bit of this and that, but we see nothing like this highly structured, highly organized, systematic thing, which is the cortex. Now, I want to say a little bit about how it comes to be that mammalian mothers and sometimes fathers take care of the offspring. Now, all vertebrates have oxytocin and vasopressin, and they serve a number of different roles. But in mammals, it is put to very new jobs. And in particular, it's very important as the mother and the infant bond. And partly what happens is that with the flood of oxytocin, both in the mother and in the baby, there are changes in the hypothalamus in the brain and elsewhere too, so that there is a deepening attachment. And what that means behaviorally is that if the infant is separated from the mother, then the mother feels pain, anxiety, and worry, and so forth. When they're back together, they both feel good. Oxytocin is by no means the only important thing in this story. In fact, the endogenous opiates are extraordinarily important as the attachment and the reconnection between separated individuals coming together. So we have here something very new in mammals, and that is wanting to be together. It feels good to be together. It feels bad to be separated. And when we are together, we do things like take care not only of my safety and warmth and food, but its safety and warmth and food. It's like that brainstem circuitry just expands to include not just me, but me and mine. And I put this slide in here really, it's a slide I got from Don Pfaff at Rockefeller, but it's just a reminder that the story is not simple. I'm giving you a kind of fast gloss over it, so you can always go deeper if you want. But the story of the circuitry for mammalian maternal and paternal behavior is complicated. We don't know very much about it yet. And the way that these various hormones and peptides interact is also very complicated. And some of this might come out in the discussion. So this kind of gives us the first step, which I think in evolutionary terms is huge, where you get from not just caring about self, but caring about others and expending energy on behalf of the others. Turtles do not do that. It may be that there were some reptiles that do, and of course birds, as we all know, do. So the next question that I had was, so how do you get from that This was really where I left off with Paul MacLean. So where do you go from there? And everything kind of came together, at least for me, and maybe it was just a false epiphany, but everything kind of came together for me when I learned about the prairie voles. Now, many of you will know about the story of the voles, but since I really like telling it because it's so cool, I'll say a little bit about it now. So you can see in this picture roughly the size of the vole. This is Sue Carter, who did some of the very early important work. And you can see the male, sorry, that's probably the male, and this is the female, and the pups. He huddles over the pups and takes care of them. Now, there are many, many species of vole. And what interested Sue Carter was a very important observation, which was that after the first mating between male and female prairie vole, they bond for life. They stay together, they like to be together, they hang out together, the male guards the nest, helps take care of the babies, and they're very distressed when separated. Montane voles, they look very similar, show none of that behavior. The male and the female do not bond, they don't stay together, and so forth. So Sue Carter asked the question, what's the difference in the brain? There has to be a difference in the brain. And eventually the answer, we don't think it's yet the whole answer, but it's a substantial part of the answer, came out. And I'm going to show you that in the next slide. Now, what you're looking at are slices of prairie vole brain cut this way. And on top, what you've got here are montane voles and prairie voles. Now, OTR means oxytocin receptor. So for any neurochemical to do anything, it has to bind to a receptor on a neuron. And then it changes some aspect of that neuron's behavior. It may make it more likely to fire or less likely to fire. So receptors, if you don't have receptors, you're out. So receptors are critical. So that's oxytocin receptors and vasopressin receptors. All right. So what they found in prairie voles was a density of oxytocin receptors in one very particular area of the reward system, the nucleus accumbens. And you don't see anything like that density of receptors in the montane vole. The other thing they found was one very particular place, again in the reward system, the ventral pallidum. And in the prairie voles, there's a high density of receptors for vasopressin, and in the montane voles, there is not. Now, initially, of course, you don't know whether that's significant, and so you do all of the manipulations, and you block receptors, and so on and so forth. And it has held up. And that, of course, opened up a huge area of research into whether other animals that show strong mate preference also have a similar anatomical profile, and what do we know about humans. Now, I should just say that strong pair bonding, I've got to say two things about it. First of all, it doesn't imply sexual exclusivity, which is kind of interesting, and it doesn't in birds. And the way we know that, obviously, is through DNA. So even when the voles like to stay together, there may be a little, as the English say, crumpet on the side, or in the case of the female, a stud muffin on the side, I guess. But nevertheless, they do stay together, and the male will continue to guard that particular nest. Now, there was one other thing I was going to tell you about that. About humans. What do we know about humans? Well, we don't know very much. And the reason we don't know very much is we don't have the techniques to do the analysis. And I'll tell you why. I mean, they'll come, but we're not there yet. So here's how you identify density of receptors in the prairie vole. So you get your little prairie vole, and you put a dye that will preferentially bind to oxytocin receptors in his brain, let him run around for a few days, and then sacrifice him, and then slice up the brain and look. And obviously that's not a technique that's available for all of us. There are speculations about human behavior. Anthropologists are really the ones to look to for this, and we can talk a little bit more about that anon. So I really want to emphasize the point that social urges are really regulated by pleasure and pain, that the reward system and the endogenous opiates are really a critical part of the story. And that there can be, for the female prairie vole, for example, there's pleasure in giving food, there's pain when there's separation, there's pain with shunning. So the hypothesis then is that in highly social animals, not necessarily just those that have long-term pair bonding, but that in highly social animals, you're going to see a shift from taking care of offspring to attachment and bonding to others. And that once there's attachment and bonding, then there is care-appropriate behavior, not necessarily genetically programmed, but care-appropriate behavior that follows upon that. Now, of course, there are many, many mammals that are social, and only about 5%, as I said, show long-term pair bonding. And so we would expect to find quite different patterns of hypothalamic circuitry in the organization of receptors for oxytocin and vasopressin that would help us explain that. But certainly we're not there yet. So what actually does oxytocin do, you might ask? And behaviorally, what we know is that when you administer oxytocin, that defensive postures are decreased. That initially an animal might be vigilant when there's a strange animal coming in with an increase in levels of oxytocin, they relax. We know that there are interactions between oxytocin-releasing neurons in the hypothalamus and the amygdala, which is a subcortical structure that regulates fear. And it looks like, but this is not known for sure, that there is a downregulation of fear activity in that part of the amygdala that would be important for fear, feelings of fear. There are also connections to brainstem so that there is a downregulation of arousal, a downregulation of the fight and flight response, and allowing, therefore, the sort of rest and digest response. When it's been looked at more closely, there is, to a first approximation, but this is not completely true, there is a sort of opposition between stress hormones like cortisol or corticotropin releasing factor and oxytocin. When oxytocin goes up, the stress hormones go down. And that, of course, has motivated research on the use of oxytocin, for example, in post-traumatic stress disorder and certain other things. Now, there are many, many different kinds of mammals, and I just kind of briefly want to make the point that the particular style of sociality that a species of mammal will, of course, be governed by the usual features of evolutionary biology. I think wolves are a particularly interesting example because because they live together in these very tight groups, and they show cooperation. They also appear to have a non-trivial capacity for understanding the intentions and goals of others. So when they want to hunt, they get together. I usually give this talk to Americans, and they don't know very much about wolves, so they get quite excited about this, that the wolves get together and howl, and that brings in the pack. And in the next slide, they can, as a group, end up doing certain kinds of things. In this case, I just love this, actually. So there's the grizzly who's brought down a moose, and the grizzly does not have a chance because the wolves will harass and harass and harass, and he finally gives up. Notice who's here, right? So how did the wolves know? How did the wolves know? And the answer is, for people who've studied the ravens, is the raven leads the wolves to the kill. Now, the ravens aren't doing it because they just really like wolves. What happens is after the wolves have tucked in a bit, the other ravens flock in, and they harass and harass and harass the wolves, and eventually the wolves have to leave. So there are many different styles of being a mammal and styles of sociality. Just to go back to wolves, I think it's very interesting that in the wolf pack, there's only one breeding pair. And whether it's done through smell, probably, and it's the olfactory connecting to the hormonal system, probably breeding in the other females is suppressed. Wolves do what many, many social mammals do, and that is if somebody is troublesome to the group, bites inappropriately, doesn't do his job, they kick him out. And very close work has been done studying lone chimpanzees, lone baboons, lone wolves, lone coyotes, and the answer is always the same. They don't last very long. They have to scrounge for small stuff like scrawny rabbits. They can't get good big protein like from a caribou. And of course, they are easy game for predators. Meerkats are kind of interesting because they also have very important forms of cooperation. In this particular instance, one of the males take turns being sentries, and they're looking out for lions. And so he's standing up there watching for lions. If he sees a lion, he'll call, and then everybody scurries back from where they're hunting and goes down the hole. And so there are many, many forms in which sociality can take place. And I think the connection to birds ultimately will turn out to be very revealing also, because birds are certainly intensely social. And then whereas most mammals are not long-term pair bonders, most birds are. I used to think it was just Canada geese, and yay, but no. All right. Now, the other part of the story, of course, concerns aggression. With social life comes many forms of tension. There's often competition for resources and for females within the group. This is certainly true in small groups of human hunter-gatherers, but it's also true in all of the groups of social mammals that have been studied intensively, like baboons and chimpanzees. And it's very interesting to me that reconciliation after conflict is seen, and it's the same kind of deal, that there will be a submission on the part of one, and then the others will come in and stroke and touch, or in the case of wolves, they will lick, and it's sort of getting everything back on an even keel. In the case of humans, and I don't have too much time to talk about this, but in the case of humans, of course, conflict within the group as well as conflict between groups remains a huge issue, and it's always an issue for discussion. And it's fascinating to me that different groups have quite different ways of resolving or dealing with certain kinds of problems. The Inuit, for example, have been described by some anthropologists as tolerating a certain amount of murder, especially in the case of wife absconders. It happens, what are you going to do? But what they don't tolerate is that escalating to wholesale feud. And you see the same kind of thing in the case of the Cheyenne and even the Comanches, who are much more apt to be highly aggressive, for example, than the Cheyenne. Now, of course, things change enormously with the advent of agriculture. Roughly 10,000 years ago, where groups began to be much larger and to be more settled. And instead of my being able to be controlled by you sort of staring at me disapprovingly or wagging your finger, now you're a stranger to me, and it doesn't matter so much. And in that context, it does appear that a rather different form of social rules, norms, and practices begin to emerge. Hitherto, as in the case of the Inuit until very recently, or in the case of the Trobriand Islanders, they don't, or the Pitaha in Brazil is another lovely example. They don't actually have explicit rules that are written down, but kind of everybody knows what they are by virtue of the stories they tell and the way everyone picks up certain kinds of styles of sociality as they grow up. But with the aggregation of large groups where many people interact with strangers, it seems to be then that there is a greater need for making rules and laws explicit. Now, in my Thursday talk, I'll have a lot more to say about implicit rules that are often quite difficult for people to actually articulate, as in the case of the Inuit, and as opposed to the emergence of stated explicit laws in sort of codified form. But certainly, especially in the early stages, I think that what was more important than the criminal law were rules about business and contracts and credit and paying back and so forth. Now, I'm close to being finished, but because there is very often an emphasis in moral philosophy, especially on reasoning, and because I think in our own lives we often confront moral issues where our intuitions don't tell us anything much. The question of what reasoning is and what the role of reasoning is and the relation between emotions and drives and reasoning, I think, is really important. My view about that is quite dark in the sense that, so far as I can tell from looking at the research, it's a completely unsolved problem. That the most we can say at this point in a sort of rough way is that it looks like a constraint satisfaction process. Roughly meaning that there are a variety of factors, including what we now call emotions, perceptions, memories, predictions of consequences, values for this rather than that, and somehow out of this melee emerges an answer. And sometimes it's an answer that we then go back and revise in ways that's really not understood. And there are, of course, psychological studies regarding failures to reason in what are believed to be optimal ways and so forth. But they're very dissatisfying most of the time because they're in the small, that is, they don't take into account the wider context in which reasoning, and in particular reasoning that reflects long-term habits of how to do things right, just as Aristotle thought. They're sort of detached from all that. And so I always fail those things. I always do the wrong thing. All right, so I want to just end then with David Hume, and this is really a description of Simon Blackburn's that caught my attention, and I thought really summed up the sort of heart of how I think about morality. Humans, they're partially selfish, as indeed we are. We're partially sympathetic, as indeed we are. We're able to take the point of view of another. That is, we are able to attribute goals and intentions and sometimes beliefs and sometimes desires. But so are chimpanzees and so are crows. And we are able to evolve institutions. And I think for how we think about ourselves in the current context, the force and the importance of institutions just cannot be overstated. Sorry. That institutions, I mean, sometimes it seems like the really sexy moral issues are about abortion. But actually, in terms of effects on people's lives, there's other things that are probably at least as important and maybe more so. Taxation. How do you tax? So it turns out, if I may go back to an American example, that Mitt Romney last 10 years, something like $410 million, which is nice. Mitt Romney pays 13% on his $410 million. I, of course, pay 32% on what is not invested, of course, but what I work for. So people who work in the United States pay a premium of approximately 10 to 15% in income tax, whereas people who invest and get dividends pay this low, low rate. Now, I don't know whether to be bothered by that in a sense or not. I mean, my initial response is, wow. But this is just by way of saying that often it's these institutional things that have a huge effect on people's day-to-day lives. And whether they prosper, whether they have well-being, whether things go on in a good way or not. And often the answer to those really big institutional questions, and whether you should adjust this way or whether you should adjust that way, do not depend at all on intuitions. They depend on facts. So with that, I'm going to stop and leave it open to discussion, and I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you. Yes?
Do you think that the alpha wolf has a different biology than the other wolves in the tribe?
It's a really interesting question. Well, there's got to be something different.
Okay, so is there,
Okay.
in Mitt Romney, is there a different biology to the human tribe, to the...
No, he's doing what the law allows. If I were in his boots, I'd do the same thing. That's what the law allows. The question is what the law should be.
Well, this discussion was about
income tax.
neurobiology and vasopressin and oxytocin and attachment and trust and all of that stuff for an evolutionary basis. So I think from the little data that I have, maybe I could make an argument that Mitt Romney is a survivor in,
yeah, you might.
in a struggle for resources.
You might.
So it boils down to, does the alpha wolf have a different biology?
Well, we think it does. And one of the studies that was done concerned serotonin. I mean, I don't think this study was ever replicated, and I don't know how good it was, and it was stopped sort of partway through. But the study was this. They had a colony of monkeys. These were captive monkeys, not field monkeys, rhesus. And of course, and rhesus do have a hierarchy. Not all social mammals do, but rhesus do. And so what they did was they serotonin depleted the alpha male and upped the level of serotonin of one of the young Turks. And very quickly, the leadership changed. So they did that a few times, and then they, I forgot how exactly this went. Maybe somebody knows this. So then the researcher thought he would try this with football players. I think this was in Los Angeles, and he went to the Los Angeles Rams were there at the time. And, I do remember, he did deplete and add, and it was just a mess. But it's an interesting question. Now, in the case of humans, I mean, what you have to remember is that the complexity is such that the social complexity and the complexity of our big fat brains is such that you can't make, really easy moves here. But of course, I mean, what we do know is that Mitt Romney was very tenacious and very organized, and he had a good head for business, and he took Bain Capital to great places. So I'm not saying that what he did is wrong. I really wanted to draw attention to the institution. It's the institution of taxation. I mean, if I were he, I wouldn't say, well, heck, the institution is wrong, so I'm just going to give a lot more tax. I mean, nobody does that. Okay, yes?
Sure, I wonder, do you see the evolution of the cortex as being by fits and starts or continuous? I'm wondering whether we really are the same creatures as the early Homo sapiens.
I see, yeah.
And the reason I ask,
Yeah.
it strikes me that if it's a continuous process, then surely we could be different creatures than Aristotle's time.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful question. Yeah. Yeah, no, I'll tell you what the geneticists say, and that is that in looking at very ancient hominin DNA and modern Homo sapiens DNA, they don't see anything much. Now, what we know, I mean, it doesn't mean that evolution stops in its tracks. And we know that there have been some genetic changes that we can actually track. And the best known and the best documented one is lactase persistence. So after the advent of agriculture, it must have occurred to some people to start milking their camels or their goats or what have you. And eventually, for people who had herding animals that could produce milk, some of them went on to develop a persistence of the enzyme lactase that helps break down milk, but that normally peters out after weaning. And so there are quite a few people with lactase persistence, but there are still people who lack it. And it's believed to have evolved at least 4 different times. Probably once or maybe twice in Europe, and at least twice in Africa. So we know about that. We also know about changes in skin color. But what everybody is interested in is, are there cognitive changes? So there are people who think that with the advent of agriculture and men, weren't fighting so much and they weren't, killing stuff as much and they became docile. Now, I don't know where the evidence for docility is actually, but in any case, there's not the slightest bit of evidence for it. That's not to say it's not true. We don't know for sure. But there's no real evidence for that. And bear in mind, you've got to have many, many, many generations in order to get an effect that spreads through the population. And of course, most changes are deleterious. So you really have the arithmetic working against you. And finally, of course, from Mother Nature's point of view, it's so much easier to make a genetic change in something like an enzyme and keep that enzyme being produced than it is to make a change in a whole network of genes that builds a brain that does a whole bunch of stuff. And once you get to building brains, these aren't single genes that are doing things. These are whole networks of genes, and the genes interact with the environment in very particular ways. And if you don't get that effect, the genes aren't expressed and blah, blah, blah. So most of the geneticists I know are not very eager to say that there has been any interesting change, so far as we know. Yeah. And then I'll come back on this side. I realize I have a left bias here. Yeah.
You've given us a very interesting account of the sort of chemical biology of attachment and trust. And I wonder how deterministic you think that is and how much it really gives us a predisposition to be trusting and attached, but that we learn the way to do it. From watching people around us.
Well, that certainly is important for sure. Michael Meany, who is a Canadian researcher in Toronto, did these wonderful experiments where you take the rat pups away from the mom and then you do everything that you need to do to keep them healthy and thriving. And of course, behaviorally, they're nuts. They don't socialize properly. They can't get mates properly, or when they have babies, they don't know how to take care of them. They're nuts, if I may use a technical term. Other work has been done on humans to sort of see whether or not there are differences in adults. So this was a study done on human females. There was the control group who had a normal nurturing upbringing, and then there was the experimental group that had been abused and neglected and so forth. And what they were interested in is, first of all, the social behavior, which of course had already been well documented. This group is very different. they have great difficulty forming long-term attachments. But when they looked at oxytocin levels, what they found was this group had significantly lower oxytocin levels. Now, that may be because having been neglected and abused and things, they have much higher cortisol levels. And when cort goes up, oxytocin goes down. So, and there are also measurement issues about oxytocin that we can get into if anybody wants to hear about that. But so I think there is no doubt about that in social animals. The attachment with the parent, the mom or the dad or both, as well as within the group, is tremendously important. The infant is picking up all the time, even if they are not sort of overt imitators, but they're picking it up all the time. So, and there's wonderful data. Nobody asked me this, but I just have to tell you because it's so neat. Chris Besh, who is a field anthropologist studying chimpanzees, made a discovery which really kind of upended the chimpanzee world. He had, over time, found 5 different males who adopted infants whose mothers had been killed or died or otherwise were out of the picture. And the videotape of this is really extraordinary. I mean, these guys, they were not genetically related, DNA.
Animal.
Pardon?
Which animal?
Oh, chimpanzee. And nobody had ever seen a male unrelated to a baby adopt the baby. And here's these dads, adopted dads running around with, just like a mom with a chimp on top and teaching them how to break nuts. And it was, so it's very interesting. But I know that wasn't your question.
It's another very good example of what we were talking about.
Yes, it is. It is. No, this learning the social behavior within the group, within the family, within the wider group is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. I'm going to go over to the other side because I've been ignoring them. Yes.
Just you mentioned instincts, habits, reason, and for reason, at the very end, you said it has to do with constraint satisfaction processes. And honestly, I don't know what you mean by
I don't really either. No, I mean, I don't. All I mean is that by constraints, I just mean that there are a number of factors that you have to take into account in coming to your decision. So I think that most of our decisions are constraint satisfaction problems. So let me just give you an example. So you're in a department, say a philosophy department, and you want to make a new hire. Well, you want somebody who's not going to cost too much, and somebody who's going to be a good teacher, but also somebody who's going to be a good researcher, and somebody who's going to get along with other people. But you're willing to compromise a bit on this if this is really good, or you compromise a bit on this if that's really good. That's a constraint satisfaction problem. And I think most of our decisions are like that. So that if I'm trying to decide whether to have aggressive cancer therapy or hospice care, I go through, could do it this way, and there's no syllogism involved. And it doesn't look anything like deductive logic, that's for sure. We don't know exactly what it looks like, except that, if you think about this geometrically, there is a kind of shape to the decision space, and the brain kind of finds a local minimum. But it's a big unsolved problem in neuroscience. And it is, although I think maybe some psychologists feel like they've made some progress at the behavioral level, I tend to feel, and I could just be wrong about this, that it's a totally unsolved problem in psychology. Yeah. Yeah.
This is related to the other question about determinism.
Mm.
I'm wondering if, in your opinion, you feel that trust creates the oxytocin creates the trust, or if they work hand in hand? I
think that's a lovely question. It's a positive feedback loop. Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And it's, there's going to be big individual variability. I mean, we know that some babies are born and are quite anxious, and some attach very easily, and we don't really know why, and so forth. Yeah, but there was a question over. Yeah.
So I don't think you really got into this, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on, given our understanding of our evolutionary past, or at least our putative evolutionary past, as well as our current understanding of both human biology and psychology. on how this knowledge impacts how we use morality in a modern society, given that we understand there are numerous biological factors and numerous other factors such as economic factors, wealth, availability, social factors that determine how it is that we come to particular decisions, and yet those probably exist on a relativistic scale, and yet many of our moral beliefs such as freedom or don't murder or those such things are derived from a more absolute type of morality. So how do you think that our knowledge of the basis for human morality in terms of a biological sense interacts with our social institutions which produce these absolutist moral beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question too. And one of the effects, clearly, of tuning up the reward system in a social context is that people become completely convinced of the rightness of the norms of their own group, right? That's not to say, I mean, humans are very flexible and often do change their ideas, and some people more easily than others. But it is an interesting question whether part of the evolutionary story, at least in the case of hominin social behavior, has been to tune that up really strongly so that people do have absolutist beliefs. So that when I want to get you all excited to go and attack the neighbors, right? And I say, you must do it for king and country or whatever it happens to be. That if you're tuned up in the right sort of way, you're not going to question it. You're just going to haul off and do it. I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. I like to imagine that the story, if it should turn out to be approximately correct that I've told today, will allow people a little bit more distance from some of their own convictions. Philip Kitcher has a new book out too called The Ethical Project, and he really takes up Dewey's point that many of the institutions that we fashion are kind of moral experiments. And that when you see institutions in that context, it helps you to understand that sometimes there are unintended consequences and you've got to adjust. And sometimes you do things in a slightly different way. And when conditions change, you may have to change your laws and so forth. And I think that's very appealing. And I think it also it sort of fits just where I'm thinking about these things. But, there are always, in any aspect of biology, there's always the bell curve and the big fat tails. And, of course, we know that there are some people who are moral fanatics, and they will do anything for, whatever it happens to be. They'll follow Jimmy Jones to Guyana and drink strychnine-laced Kool-Aid. I mean, what's with that? So, yeah. What?
A gun. They either take the strychnine or they get shot in the head.
Yeah, well, they could have ganged up on the lad, I suppose. Okay, I think I'm back over here. Yeah.
You talked a lot about oxytocin causing trust. And so trust to me seems more like a moral action type emotion or something like that. Like if I love my children, I will, throw down my life for them, and then if that expands to my friends or whatever, this is how sort of altruism might occur. But I'm curious about like the other half of morality, which is really more like moral judgment, and like the more cognitive aspects of it. And I'm just, do you think that, I'm just curious as to where you think the oxytocin might lead to that endpoint?
Well, I think it's very hard to say exactly because I don't think we really know. I mean, I wouldn't exactly say that oxytocin causes trust. I think that we know that it has a role in attachment. We know that it has a role in downregulating fear responses. And that when I'm not fearful of you, I'm more likely to be able to do something like cooperate with you in order to achieve a common end, or I am more likely to help you, perhaps even with the expectation that I will ultimately be helped. Does it have a role in more cognitive things? Well, I mean, there are some people, I mean, there is one experiment. I think this is kind of I don't even know if I believe this experiment. Anyway, here's the experiment. So you take a bunch of guys and you give them these tests where they look at a face. I think this is one that Simon Baron-Cohen developed. Is that right? The test where you look at the face and you're supposed to say what the emotion is. You can find this online. And these guys were sort of not terribly good at it. And so then they put intranasal oxytocin in and waited for a few minutes and they got better. Well, I don't know. I mean, does it really enhance your capacity to attribute mental states to others? I mean, there's so many confounds and there's so much complexity that I wouldn't put hard money on it, let's say. But the other thing is I don't really distinguish in a very serious way between values, emotions, and cognition. I mean, that's a suitable way of categorizing things now because we don't know enough. But it's not a very suitable way of categorizing things. We can already see that in the long run.
So I guess maybe to clarify, there's sort of the camp of morality that it grows out of attachment and it grows out of trust and that kind of thing. And then there's this other distinct camp that morality actually grows out of necessity in cooperative relationships that don't function from just attachment relationships, that are sort of the result of just needing to be able to sort of savvily get along with other people.
Well, I'm sure that probably happens, of course. I mean, that's why I wanted to describe sociability in terms of a platform. And undoubtedly, once the platform is there, then many different kinds of superstructures can grow on that platform, and morality can take many different forms. And so that almost certainly sometimes people see the necessity of cooperating, but bear in mind that I kind of tried to work that part in as part of the problem-solving capacity. So that I was bringing in problem solving as humans try to figure out ways of lowering tensions and conflict, of dealing with scarce resources, of dealing with attacks and so forth, or of how to get a bridge built or how to get a school built and so forth. And I think of that as social problem solving, but it's not going to happen without this platform of trusting and wanting to be together and so on and so forth. That's how it looks. So I don't think that those two are mutually exclusive in any sense. Yeah. And then I'll come back to you. Yeah.
Yes, this is about trust too. You described how, as society evolves from caring about self, caring about tribe, trust widens to institutions and nations and so forth.
Yeah.
But doesn't at the same time mistrust also go along with it?
Oh, for sure.
We've only got to look at the current financial state of things to see that institutions are highly distrusted, financial, political, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle actually made this point very beautifully also, which is that within the social group there are always tensions, right? And you want to cooperate, but you kind of want to, you don't want to be an idiot. You don't want to be a sucker. But so, yeah, I mean, you got to find, as he would have said, you have to find a balance. And always within social groups, whether it's the family or whether it's the, the department or whatever it is, there's always tensions. And a lot depends on whether people don't care about that and are happy to let instabilities destroy the thing, or whether they're willing to take steps to ensure that the instabilities don't destroy the group. But oh yeah, I mean, I'm not under any illusion that any group is, it's all cheerful and happy. Absolutely not. Should we take one more? Yeah.
Some of what you've talked about are physical things in the brain, like oxytocin, cortex, other stuff you talked about functional states like trust and love and things like this. To me, the connection between those two isn't obvious. So to use an analogy, I could ask you, how does the spreadsheet on my computer figure out an average? And you could say, well, it involves electrons and it happens in the CPU. And that's true. But to really understand the connection, you need to say something, you need to explain binary logic and something about how binary logic can be used to create complex programs and something about how it gets instantiated, using logic gates and electrons. And then you connect to those two. So I'm wondering whether you can tell a similar story that connects the oxytocin and the states, the functional states.
Well, I think we know a little bit about that. And I sort of alluded to that in saying that one of the things that does happen is that oxytocin-releasing neurons project to the amygdala, or at least to the lateral amygdala, where the fear-generating aspects, if I may put it crudely, are. And it downregulates activity in the amygdala. It downregulates arousal in the brainstem. And what that, amongst other things, what that does is lowers your stress hormones. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about trust in this context. That is, if I'm not vigilant and alert and anxious and concerned, then I'm more apt to sit down and we might even end up chatting, and we might even end up cooperating. And that kind of behavior is quite easily seen when you can manipulate oxytocin levels in animals. Now, there's been a lot of human work done, with nasal spray. I mean, the first work came out of the Zurich lab of Ernst Fehr. And what they did was there are these neuroeconomic games, and the idea is that in this particular game, this guy is given a sum of money, and he's called the investor, and this guy is called the trustee. And he can send any amount of money he wants to the trustee, and the trustee can send any amount back. However, the kick is that if he sends, whatever amount he sends forward is tripled by the experimenter. And so you play that in iterated series. And so what they found, and it's a trust game in the sense that if the trustee keeps all the money and doesn't send any back, then on the next iteration, of course, I don't give him any. I don't trust him anymore. So what was the result? Well, the result was that levels of trust on the part of the investor, if that was the guy that got the oxytocin, went up. And it didn't seem to have any effect on the behavior of the trustee because, of course, he's not trusting anybody. He's just deciding whether to give back money or not. So that's the kind of link that so-called neuroeconomists have been willing to make between trusting behavior, as clearly exhibited in a real money experiment in the investor game, and nasal spray with oxytocin.
It sounds like what we're discovering is correlations between neurotransmitters or certain regions of the brain and particular behaviors, which in my analogy would be something like, when the spreadsheet runs, the hard drive spins, and so we know those are connected.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, in neuroscience, what are you going to start with? That's how you start. I mean, and then if you're lucky and you do the experiments properly, you'll get to causality. The brain is not magical. We're pretty sure about that. So there's got to be causality. Exactly how causality works in the case of something very complex like this, we're not sure. We're pretty sure how it works in the case of certain other very simple kinds of things like the vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is not all that simple, but we know how that works, and it's all causal.
Question and answer is turning into conversation. That's just the point at which we want to stop. Come across the way for more conversation. The next opportunity to hear Professor Churchland in a large public venue is at the Vancouver Institute at 8:15 on Saturday evening. It has taken us a very long time to invite you to the big house.
That's right.
We're so glad you
40 years or so.
when it was finally extended. Thank you for being such a generous guest, and we look forward to the rest of your
it's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.